Welcome to the Unlist. Today I have a funny little video for you. It's probably not going to get a lot of views, not that I really care about that, and it's the kind of thing that only the real deep in the weeds vintage enthusiasts actually would care about watching. So this is one for you guys that are really into the obscure, vintage, discontinued oftentimes fragrances, but it's one that I want to talk about because it does have a little bit of historical significance to it, whether you realize it or not. It's just history that really only would be interesting to people into the actual creative side of perfumery, involving materials and things like that. So, without further ado, we're going to talk about a fragrance that I actually own. Typically, I'm not really into showing bottles because that's what all of the influencers and hype people do. They get the free bottles from the PR lists from the brands so they can shill them at you. So I tend to make my videos very like non-show and non-tell. So I talk about the fragrance. You see my face on camera, but I'm not pushing a bottle in your face. You have to assume that I've either sampled it somewhere or, you know, I own the bottle, or maybe just a decant. Like, ownership of a fragrance shouldn't really make a difference on whether or not you can have a valid critique of that fragrance. I think that's silly. There are other fragrance reviewers out there who disagree. They think you should own the fragrance and wear it for like 30 years before you have the right to speak on it. And that's okay. Y'all can keep thinking that, but that's just a very expensive opinion to have, honestly. And it's a very time-consuming one because you can spend a lifetime with a fragrance and still not see it as clearly as someone who smells it in 10 minutes. Just all depends on the person, okay? Not everyone has the same level of perception. Anyway, this is one that I do actually own, so I can, once in a rare opportunity, actually show you a bottle. I will do that a little later, but first let's talk about the fragrance itself before I start going woo with bottles. Okay, so fragrance is called The Baron, and it was originally launched by a brand called Evian, and Evian was the primary maker and seller of this fragrance until probably, I want to say, the 90s, when Evian folded and some of its properties were bought up by another brand. I think Elizabeth Arden ended up picking up its most famous fragrance, which is White Shoulders, originally launched in 1943, but a lot of its fragrances went to different companies. It was picked apart like carrion meat, okay? It's a similar thing that happened to Houbigant. When Houbigant originally crashed and burned after like, almost 2 centuries of being in operation. When Houbigant finally collapsed, it too was picked apart. Some of its fragrances went to Dana, some of its fragrances went here, went there. And when it was reorganized, it kept some of its most popular fragrances that it could then later reissue at a much higher price point as a niche fragrance, but that's different history for a different fragrance. So back to Evian. Evian was picked apart, and the Baron ended up going to a brand called LTL, which LTL was actually formed from the ashes of Evian after a reorganization. So technically it's the same company, just no longer operating under the original owners anymore. So anyway, the Baron came out in 1961 and then had a soft relaunch in 1965. That's important for historical reasons, for purpose of why I'm making this video. Before we get into that, though, I need to give you some historical context on the creation of the Baron and why any of this matters anyway. So White Shoulders came out in 1943. It was a powdery, floral, musky fragrance, and it was created sort of as like a fragrance from husband to wife. So the actual owners of Evian were a husband and wife team. The wife was a woman named Evelyn Diane Westall, okay, and she had some money. She came from money. Her husband was a guy named, and I'm looking over at my resources here, so pardon my head turning. It's a very difficult name to say. Walter Langer von Langendorff. Yeah, That sounds like a villain from like a cartoon, right? Like a cartoon villain, Walter Langer von Langendorff. It gets even sillier because he was supposedly a baron, hence the name of this fragrance being the Baron. So it's technically Baron Walter Langer von Langendorff. Think about that, Baron Walter Langer von Langendorff. That's just, I can't get over that. That's like Doofenshmirtz Evil Incorporated, okay? It's ridiculous. So, anyway, so Mr. von Langendorff, whether or not he was really a baron didn't really make a difference. He was a chemist, and thus was also a perfumer. He had actually perfumed White Shoulders, and likewise, he perfumed this fragrance, the Baron. So, what he effectively did was went back to the core of White Shoulders and made a men's version, effectively making a version for himself, because White Shoulders was made for his wife, Evelyn Diane Westall, and together the two of them, you know, the Van from Walter Langer Van Langendorff and Evelyn from Evelyn Diane Westall got smashed together to make Evian. So it's another portmanteau, like my last video I discussed. Mastige was a portmanteau. Well, here we go. Evian, another portmanteau. So as the men's version of the Baron, you can expect a fragrance that's very floral, a bit powdery, a bit ambery. It's not a super kind of manly fragrance because it's effectively a men's fragrance built around the skeleton of a woman's fragrance, very similar to what Bernard Chant did with a lot of stuff that he did for Estee Lauder, including how Aramis 900 was really a reworked Aromatics Elixir, and so on and so forth. JHL was a reworked Cinnabar. So this is another situation like that. The Baron was reworked from White Shoulders. Do they smell the same? No. In fact, I would posit that the Baron actually smells more different from White Shoulders than any of the Bernard Chant stuff does from its female counterpart. So Aramis 900 and Aromatics Elixir, you can almost close your eyes and blindfold those and not really know which one's which. But the Baron and White Shoulders, you will definitely tell them apart. So let's not get that twisted. Okay, they are different enough that they don't feel like flankers. Okay, but you can tell the structure is the same. You can tell the base was the same. So the whole point of the Baron was to market a fragrance on his own dubious royal claim, effectively royal title. And this was in the early 60s, 1961. So my guess is that Evian needed another hit, and they also needed a fragrance in the men's segment, because after the mid-century, men started coming around, at least in the United States, because Evian is an American company. At least in the United States, men started coming around more to wearing fragrance, to the office, you know, to the pub, wherever. But they were no longer just, okay, I want my aftershave and that's it. They started to go, oh, hey, I might like a nice cologne for this occasion or that. Interest would continue to build, as you know, into the 70s and 80s. So it's just the genesis of it in the 60s. But it was still enough to make brands go, hey, maybe we should do something. And that's why Dior did something in 65, right? So not a ton of brands were jumping on the bandwagon yet. I mean, Chanel and Rochas were kind of early to the game in the late 40s and mid 50s. A lot of the designers were passing on men's fragrances, you know, for a while. So Yves Saint Laurent wouldn't launch a men's fragrance until like 71. So he had his first women's fragrance in 64, and it just sat. Didn't really see the need for one. So getting back on track here, the Baron was cashing in on the idea of the proper gentleman's ennobled kind of scent. Smell like a baron, smell like you come from better breeding than you actually do, because maybe you're some redneck podunk hick or whatever that was born and raised in the hills. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with that. This is not good optics for cosmetic brands, you know, having you in overalls with a straw coming out of your mouth and a big brim hat or whatever, blowing on a jug of whiskey, making some music. That's not something that sells perfume bottles, okay? As cool and rustic and Americana as that is, doesn't sell perfume bottles. So the whole idea was, let's do something that feels more of higher status. And a lot of the fragrances coming out in the 50s too, into the 60s, did have a sort of ennobled feel. I mean, that's why a lot of the French fragrances stuck with the French, you know. That's why it was Monsieur de Givenchy and not Mr. It could have been Mr. Givenchy for American audiences, but no, they kept it French, right? So, stuff like that. And then, of course, you know, Royal Copenhagen, which came out a decade after the Baron. So you see where I'm going with this. That whole aristocratic aspect of you are ennobled by wearing this fragrance. You are made better by wearing this fragrance. That was a marketing ploy, you know. And, of course, it being floral and gussy and fancy, harkening back to the styles of the 19th century, stuff like Jockey Club, very floral fragrance too, you know. Zizanie by Fragonard, very floral fragrance. You see where I'm going with this. So that was the original marketing angle, but there was a massive change in 1965, 4 years after the initial launch of the Baron. It was given a soft relaunch with a different bottle shape and a different label. Those 60s bottles are square, basically. They're tall and square, have a black label, a round cap, but they're square. And they came in a typical assortment of aftershave with cologne, maybe a bar soap, because men were into wet shaving. They didn't just want a cologne, they wanted a full shebang, like with the Old Spice mugs and stuff, right, in a little puck soap. That's what they wanted, so that's what they got. 65, though, the Baron was put in the bottle that we now know it to be in, which is where I get to show you finally what the bottle looks like. So here's what it looks like. Now, the ones like this that are completely silver are cologne. Clear ones, where it's a silver label but the glass is clear, those tend to be aftershave. Not always, but usually they tend to be aftershave. So if you want cologne, you have to buy the silver one like this. Now this is an LTL bottle, so this was created after the 90s. Well, after the 90s began, so probably mid-90s. This is a 90s specimen because Evian folded by then. If you have anything older than the 90s, 80s and back, going all the way back to the original year of 61, those are going to all be Evian bottles. And after 65, they're going to look like this anyway. So unless you want to be that deep vintage guy, you know, the comic book guy of, I gotta have the oldest possible bottle, you know, that person, then yeah, you can go after those square ones from the early 60s. But you're going to miss the point, which is also the point of this video. A very particular material came into existence in 1965, and I feel like our good old friend Mr. Baron Walter Langer von Langendorff, Senior, Junior, the Third, Esquire, first of his name, protector of the free perfume angles of men in Westeros and all that crap, whatever his full name is, he had an idea to do a slight shift on the fragrance. So it would still remain floral and a little bit powdery, but it got a whole heck of a lot cleaner. Whole lot cleaner. Okay? And this is how. 1965 is when we see the first synthesis made available for sale, a material called Galaxolide. Now, in the early 60s, they had developed Galaxolide, but they didn't start synthesizing it for purchase until 1965. Now, the 65 reboot of LTL, or rather, I'm sorry, scratch that, reverse it. I made a boo-boo there. I'm not going to edit it out. I don't edit my videos. The 1965 relaunch of the Baron is because they snuck a small Galaxolide note into the fragrance. One of the earliest uses of Galaxolide in a commercial fragrance, because most of the early adopters of Galaxolide in the 60s were laundry soap fragrance. So we're talking Tide and things like that, and All and all these other commercial laundry soap brands. They were using Galaxolide to scent the soap. And that's why in later years, when Galaxolide started being more commonly used in fragrances, commercial fragrances, and also high-end perfumes, a lot of people were smelling things and going, hey, why do these new perfumes kind of remind me of soap? Why do they remind me of laundry detergent, right? It's because they had gotten used to the smell being in their Tide bottles, being in their All or whatever brand they use, Brisk, whatever the brands are. I don't know all the brands, okay? Gain didn't exist back then, so if you're a Gain user, then you're out of luck. But, so, the thing is, the Galaxolide, on its own, has a sort of slightly sweet, floral, woody, musky odor. So when you put it in a very small, judicious amount in a fragrance, it can boost the other elements that are already there, which follow that floral, sweet, woody profile. So if you have a floral fragrance like the Baron that already relies on lavender and carnation, so that's probably eugenol, and a little bit of rose, which is probably geraniol because cheap, but if you're relying on that very dandy, okay, that very dandy sort of rose, lavender, carnation trifecta, it's trying to smell like a corsage on a guy's tuxedo, because that's the whole purpose of the Baron. The Baron is kind of like a liquid carnation. It's the corsage that goes on your suit when you go out to woo the person of your dreams. You put on the Baron and you smell like that flower, but all night long. Okay, so I feel like the earlier versions, which probably relied more on maybe animal musks. I haven't smelled the deep vintage, I can't tell you, but they probably relied on more conventional materials for the era, and they probably weren't exactly what Mr. Bergen Flurgens Zer Langer Langendorff, or whatever his name was, not exactly what he wanted. So Mr. Doofenshmirtz Evil Incorporated decided to go put this newfangled Galaxolide, like I said, not in a massive quantity. We're not talking like it doesn't smell like Wings by Giorgio, which Wings by Giorgio is like the most notorious offender of Galaxolide. Like if you smell a bottle of Wings, it just smells like laundry detergent, like you're just wearing laundry detergent. It's ridiculous. So this is not like that. This is definitely more subtle, more judicious, and I think even the vintage purist who is like oak moss all day, every day, give me oak moss or give me death, eventually both probably, even that person is going to be able to appreciate what's here because the material is used so judiciously and so subtly. And if you buy this bottle, that's what you're getting. Unless you get those really old ones, like I said, pre-65, so that first 4-year run before the material existed, they smell good too, I'm sure. But most of the reviews you read online, most of the people who wax nostalgic on how their granddad wore the Baron or their uncle wore the Baron or whatever, or it was their teenage scent, they're talking about this one. So yes, indeedy, yes, sir, Bob, you are talking about the one that has Galaxolide in it. Your nostalgia, whether you want to admit it or not, Mr. Gatekeeper, I'm looking at you. Your nostalgia for this fragrance is based on your love of Galaxolide. Now go drown your sorrows in alcohol or something, because I've got no sympathy. I don't care. But moving on, for the rest of us who don't really care about stuff like that. So what you end up with here is an interesting, light, fresh, which for the 60s, like I said, I'm not talking cool water fresh. I'm not talking Issey Miyake fresh, okay? I'm not talking Terre de Hermes. I'm talking light, fresh for that time period, okay? Light and fresh for that era of perfumery. It's still powdery, like I said. Still got it on my hand here. Still powdery. You still get sandalwood. You get plenty of that stuff. You get plenty of those other very vintage oak moss. You guys know. I don't have to tell you. If you play with vintages, you already know what the dry down is like on most of these, okay? You don't need me to remind you of what a vintage perfume smells like. It's not heavy ethyl maltol. It's not full of woody ambers. Those didn't exist. It's not full of any of that stuff. A little bit of patchouli here. A little bit. Definitely I'm getting some lily of the valley materials in here. I'm getting some of that. Possibly some ionones too, because I get a little bit of an iris pop, but I don't get a whole lot. There's not an iris note here. There's definitely not an iris note in this perfume. But the Baron sold for a long time. It became like how English leather was for a lot of people, and Brut was for a lot of people, and a lot of those commercially available drugstore fragrances. Because remember, Evyan, White Shoulders, These were drugstore. These were high street, if we're talking the UK, where every town has a high street. These were high street fragrances. These were not department stores. This wasn't Harrods, Bergdorf Goodman, Selfridges. This wasn't Bloomingdale's. You didn't, if you came for money, you didn't wear the Baron. Because the only person who would want to look like and smell like the Baron was someone who didn't have the money to actually be the Baron. Feel me? So, but that's the video, and that's the reason for the video, is Galaxolide, the much maligned and much misunderstood, and to an extent much abused polycyclic musk. Okay, it's a bit of a tough word to say, but follow with me. Polycyclic musk. That polycyclic musk that is now kind of looked at as a bogeyman of sorts for some people. This may not be the first commercial application of it. I'm not saying it is, but this is among the first commercial applications for that material in a fragrance. But again, it's dosed very low, so it's not like it takes over the fragrance. It's not pulling an ISOE. It's not pulling an Orlimbinol. It's not doing that, guys. Okay, don't get it twisted. It's not doing that. But like Prego, it's in there. And if you like this fragrance, then you don't care. It doesn't change anything for you. If you don't know what this fragrance is about, don't let it scare you. Don't let it scare you. But it's a cool little factoid, and it's a neat thing. And honestly, if you are looking for a very floral, dandy sort of vintagey, powdery, fresh, uplifting, like I said, smells like a lapel, a corsage, you're going to the prom, that's what you want, this is for you. This has been the On List.